Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Any questions about the topic we covered the last two times about slavery? Most people were here, right?
So one question. When we used to have Man Malakat Aymanuhum, they were basically their wives. They have the same rights as their wives?
Absolutely, they have the same rights as their wives. That's an important one. When a person, actually as we said, the female captive, she has options. First of all, a Muslim is encouraged, Muslims in general are encouraged, if they do capture prisoners of war, to let them go. فَإِمَّا مَنًّا بَعْدُ وَإِمَّا فِدَاءً. The verse is very clear. فَشُدُّ الْوَثَاقِ فَإِمَّا مَنًّا بَعْدُ وَإِمَّا فِدَاءً. He said, when you capture people in war, you are encouraged. The first option, Allah said, man means to basically bestow a favor on the prisoners of war by letting them go. Fida means that you let them, so letting them go for no return. That's like without any kind of compensation. That's the first option. The second option is that you accept some kind of ransom from the enemy, whether that could be a monetary ransom or they release some of your captives in return for their captives. That's another rule. حتى تضع الحرب أوزارها, until the war ends. That's the thing. Prisoners of war in Islam are to be released by the end of the war. Not like they do nowadays in Guantanamo Bay, people staying there for 15 years, or Abu Ghraib. And they talk about slavery. They say, oh, Islam had slavery. What is this? When you ship people and you tie them like this in shackles, you even give them they give them anesthetic to transport them from Afghanistan to, do you remember these things? They gave them anesthetic so that they were shackled hands and everything and put on these tables. And they also anesthetized them. Brutal treatment. And of course, despite the beating and the humiliation and desecration of the Quran, throwing the Quran in the toilets, these are all things they've actually admitted. It's not like these are claims we're making. So Muslims are not like this, and Muslims never treated the captives of war like that, and that is why captives of war in Islam, the vast majority became Muslims because they saw the good treatment, and even when they were freed by Muslims, they chose to stay amongst the Muslims rather than to go back to their people, and those were called what? Al-Mawali, right? And even they acquired, they became scholars in Islam, they attained high office, they became rulers even, rulers of the Muslim countries, despite the fact that they were actually captives of war and considered milk yamin, which means that we will not call it slavery because we really didn't have slavery in Islam by the sense that they had. I will finish that question, but I just remembered something else. Today I was listening to a guy, his name is Bill Warner. He's a big Islamophobe and a hater of Islam, and he always depicts Muslims and Islam in such a horrible way. One of the biggest lies I've heard in my life, actually. Whatever he said, I listened to it today. He says, he was talking about the transatlantic slave trade, the most brutal slavery in human history. And I told you something about it and how people were dying in transport and dying in seasoning camps and how they were treated like animals and so on, tortured, worked to death, deprived from even food and so on, families separated, sexually abused, everything. He says, yeah, there were some abuses, that's what he said, some abuses in the transatlantic slave trade. He said some abuses. Actually, it's the worst treatment of human beings in human history, but anyhow. He said, but you know why? He says, you know why those slaves came to the West? He says, because they were fleeing the Muslims. He says they were fleeing the Muslim slave traders, and that is why they came to the arms of the Western slave traders and taken to the West. How can somebody...
Complete opposite of what actually happened.
Actually, many of those slaves were Muslims. Many of the slaves they took from Western Africa were actually Muslims. And as if those guys were fleeing the Muslim slave trade, and they felt that the Western slave traders were more merciful and stuff like that. So, this is the most fantastic lie I've heard in my life. But anyhow, this is This is the length they would go to try to depict Islam in a bad image. Subhanallah, lies. They distorted history. Anyhow, but all this is documented. Whoever wants to know the truth, he can just go and read. Even on Wikipedia, you'll see all these things. We don't have to say from ourselves. Anyhow, so Muslims are encouraged to release the captives of war. I'm just going to call them captives of war because we did not really have slavery in the sense that they had. Or take ransom or release them in return for other captives of war. Or she may choose to release herself by making a contract with whoever captured her. And this is not known in human history, that they make a contract that I will release myself and I will pay you for my freedom. And whether a man or a woman, he goes to work and pays that person who captured them. Okay, this is called al-mukataba. It's mentioned in the Quran. وَالَّذِينَ يَبْتَغُونَ الْكِتَابَ مِمَّا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُكُمْ فَكَاتِبُوهُم. There's a clear command from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If this is what they want, you are obligated to oblige to that and go into this contract with them. And the moment they make the first down payment, they are free to go and work and pay you, or find somebody to help out with the payment. Even Safiya, Juwayriyah bint al-Harith, was a woman captured from a tribe called Bani al-Mustaliq at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So she was captured by his name is Ibn Qais ibn Shammas. I forgot his first name. But anyhow, she didn't want to stay in captivity. So what she did is she went to Prophet ﷺ himself. She said that I want to release myself and I don't have money and I want you to help me pay. And that is okay because the Muslim ruler is supposed to also pay from the zakah money, which is the alms the Muslims are paying. And this is one of the distribution of the alms or the charity Muslims in general pay. وَفِي الرِّقَابِ, right? That you pay that money to free people in captivity. So she said, I want you to help me. He says, I'm willing to do that, or I may offer you something else. He says, I can, if you want to become my wife, and she became his wife afterwards, your dowry, I will be, basically your freedom will be your dowry. I will pay for your freedom as a dowry. And he also freed 40 of her people as part of that dowry. Okay, she accepted and she became his wife, Juwayriyah bint al-Harith. When this happened, the remainder of the Muslims who had captives from that war, he said, how can we keep captives from the family of the wife of the Prophet ﷺ? So they also released their captives. They said in that day 100 households were released just by that. And to the extent that Aisha and some of the other women, the wives of the Prophet ﷺ, said there was nobody who had more barakah, more blessing on his people than Juwayriyah bint al-Harith. So all these options are in front of her. If she is not a Muslim at all, and she's not a Christian or a Jew, it is not allowed to establish this kind of, I'm going to call it a marital relationship with her, because it is a marital relationship in every sense. She has all the rights of the wife, okay? Because people who fell in captivity, women who fell into captivity in other nations and other religions, they were given out in prostitution and they would have sexual relationships with not only the person who they fell captive to, but even whoever he wants, like guests and friends and so on. So this is total prostitution, what was happening in other nations. But here it is a monogamous relationship between her and that person. And the Quran clearly says, فَانْكِحُوهُنَّ بِإِذْنِ أَهْلِهِنَّ وَآتُوهُنَّ أُجُورَهُنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ مُحْصَنَاتٍ غَيْرَ مُسَافِحَاتٍ وَلَا مُتَّخِذَاتِ أَخْدَانٍ. The meaning is that you marry them by the permission of their families, وَآتُوهُنَّ أُجُورَهُنَّ, and you have to pay a dowry just like you pay for your wife. مُحْصَنَاتٍ غَيْرَ مُسَافِحَاتٍ وَلَا مُتَّخِذَاتِ أَخْدَانٍ. Muhsanat means that they are chaste. غَيْرَ مُسَافِحَاتٍ وَلَا مُتَّخِذَاتِ أَخْدَانٍ. They should not have a sexual relationship that is open or hidden outside of marriage. It is very clear in that sense. Now, somebody may say, but the Quran says, إلا على أزواجهم أو ما ملكت أيمانهم إلا على أزواجكم أو ما ملكت إلا على أزواجهم أو ما ملكت أيمانهم فإنهم غير ملومين. That the Quran differentiates between the wife and the lady who fell in captivity. I think, in my opinion, this differentiation is based on the origin. This lady was the wife, she was free to start with, while this lady was a captive to start with. The captive woman, she got her dowry in the form of her freedom. Or he may exceed that by paying more, just like the Prophet ﷺ did with Juwayriyah bint al-Harith. And her son, if she has children with him, Ibrahim. Ibrahim was the son of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. He was from Maria al-Qibtiyah. And she was originally given to him by the king of Egypt, the Christian king of Egypt, al-Muqawqis, from the Akhbas, right? He sent her along with her sister and 2 other people. They were basically at his, for him, they were his slaves, and he sent them over to Prophet Muhammad ﷺ when he sent him a book with Hatib ibn Abi Balta'a calling him to Islam. So he did not accept Islam, but he sent him these, to show a token of good relationship with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Prophet ﷺ also married her, and he had his son, who is Ibrahim. Remember the story when Ibrahim died, and he says, وَإِنَّ عَلَى فِرَاقِكَ إِبْرَاهِيمُ لَمَحْزُنُونَ, and so on. Yes, so the woman, if she doesn't want all this, she can do mukataba. She can free herself through this contract with the person who held her or took her into captivity. And she was only taken into captivity because of what? Because she was amongst the army that was fighting. Yani this is not, falling into captivity is not a good thing to start with. It is, when you go into war, you have one of 2 options: either you get killed or you fall into captivity. With all the rulings that we mentioned, and also there's a hadith. There's a hadith that says that 3 people get double the reward, and one of them, he says, رجل كانت عنده جارية فأدبها أحسن تأديبها وعلمها فأحسن تعليمها ثم أعتقها وتزوجها. Look at this. He says 2 people get the reward twice. One of them, he says, one of them who had a woman fell into his captivity, became captive to him in war. He says he taught her good manners, and he actually educated her. So people who say, oh, Muslims don't educate their children, this hadith is talking about educating the prisoner of war, even. The prisoner of war educating her. And he says, and then he freed her and he married her. He freed her and فَأَعْتَقْهَا وَتَزَوَّجَهَا. So, yes, there have been abuses, but I'm talking about what are the teachings of Islam, how they should be applied properly. No matter what the abuses were in Islamic history, they come nowhere close to the abuses committed by other nations. I'll tell you, there's of course many texts in the Old Testament talking about slaves. One of the texts, for instance, says, and you can go back and review this yourself, it says if a master hits his slave with a rod, like a metal rod or a wooden rod, and the slave dies immediately, then he should be punished. But he says if the slave survives for 1 or 2 days, he should not be punished. You understand what I'm trying to say here? That obviously it is legislated that you can beat the slave in the Old Testament, and the beating can reach to him dying. If he died in 1 or 2 days, then you're free. You didn't really commit a big crime, because he still survived 1 or 2 days after that. And then it says he should be punished if he died immediately, but it doesn't say what the punishment is. What does the Islamic text say about somebody beating somebody who fell into captivity? And I will not use the term slave, because after reading about this subject in detail, I've come to the conclusion that Muslims never really had slaves in the sense of slaves. There's a Western Christian historian called Gustave Le Bon. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but he wrote a book called Civilization of the Arab, or the Arab Civilization. And I have the quote with me. He basically says that he says, I'm deeply convinced, after he studied how slaves or captives of war were treated in Islam compared to other nations, he says, I'm convinced that the way captives, he said slaves, but I'm going to say captives of war, were treated by the Muslims was far better than any other nation. He says, in a sense, those people were treated as family members. That's his word, not my word. He says they were treated as family members, and that is true. If you have to clothe them from the same clothing that you wear, you have to have them eat with you. You should not overwork them. And the hadith says, If you give them a big task, you have to get down and help them. Okay? This is exactly what you would do with a family member. And then you have to educate them, as you can see. And you are not allowed to abuse them. You're not even allowed to call them a slave, as we talked about before. And they should not call you a master. Neither this or that. The hadith says only Allah is the Rabb. They should not call you my master or my Rabb, because Allah is the Rabb. Okay, you should say my young man or my young girl, and so on. And then they have the option of going free. This was not in any other nation or any other religion. Okay, they have the option of going free, and at the same time, all the other sources that lead to slavery or being in captivity were closed off, except what could not be closed unilaterally by Muslims, which is in the relationship in war with other nations.